Dun 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 dun. Hey everybody, welcome to TPIM. That's our live. I'm your host, True Powers Mind. Today, I want to thank the Most High for yet again allowing me to come and share this information with the nation. Today, we discuss Black Moors in medieval Europe. I hope you enjoy the show. Let's do this, y'all.
Was Pintes, but yet he was always described as being very dark, or moros, or morisco, which means very dark. He then left and came to Bermuda. That's my mother's family side. And I always heard stories about the Moors, because apparently he talked about Morocco. He talked about the Moorish presence in Spain. My mother's father is from Barbados. And so when I would hear references to the Caribbean, I was always interested to see what the African presence was there. Didn't expect to find any Moorish connection, only to read Dr. Ivan Van Server's book, The African Presence in Early America, to see references to the Carib Indians and the Carib who had connections to the Moors, or at least so the Spaniards thought when they entered the Caribbean. So these are things that have since come about as a result of studying and finding out more. But my rooting, my grounding, is in looking at the impact of the Moors, of African people, on Europe, intellectual development, spiritual development, and cultural development. When you start to look at the Moors, you find out that the African presence in the form of the Moors in Europe empowered the Europeans intellectually. When you start to look at the significance of the Moors in Europe, you find that the presence of the Moors empowered Europe spiritually in ways that a lot of us may or may not recognize. You find that the Moors empowered Europeans politically because of fighting and so forth between different Moors themselves, and of course the exacerbating of these tensions by certain European powers. So first off, to begin, who are the Moors? The Moors are an African people who came primarily in the medieval period from the areas of North and West Africa. North and West Africa. In fact, the term Moor was used to designate anyone who came from anywhere from Algeria and Libya, and in fact the fringes of Egypt, straight down across the Maghreb. In fact, the areas today of Senegal, Mali, Songhai, and Ghana also refer to the inhabitants of those areas as Moors. It was a generic term. Moor comes from the Greek term moro, M-A-U-R-O, which was the term that the Greeks used for the peoples they came into contact with when they entered into northern Africa. The Romans then used the term more, borrowing the term moro from the Greek, and hence Mauritania, hence names like Maurice, including Saint Maurice, who I'll show you in a moment. So the legacy of the Moors, the reference to what a Moor was, or what was to represent in the medieval period, was clear. A Moor was an African person, period. An African person whose features would have been considered distinctly Africoid. You find later, through the confusing of the presence of the Moors and who the Moors were, you find later this obfuscation, this confusing of what a Moor represented. To the point now where people think that Moor is synonymous for Arab, or Moor and Berber are synonymous, without understanding as well what the reference of Berber means. Because when you start to look at that term itself, you find out that European scholars have duped us again when we use that term, utilize that term. As I mentioned, the Moors who come into contact with the Europeans on a large scale, 8th century, 710, an army from North Africa and Northwest Africa under the direction of an Arab general by the name of Tariq, has as one of his lieutenants an African general, a Moor named Tariq. And Tariq takes this army into the Iberian Peninsula, into what is now Spain. And in the course of a year, takes control of the entire region, all of what is now Spain and Portugal. The Moors get as far as Toulouse in France, and the legacy and the presence of the Moors begins. When the Moors came into the area, they found a society which was primarily dominated by a group of people known as the Visigoths and the Vandals. The Visigoths and the Vandals are a Germanic people, or European people. If you want to know anything about what their sense of culture or civility was, we see a living remnant in the use of the term vandal for contemporary destruction of property and mayhem and rape, pillage, and burn concepts. So in terms of what sort of reality they practiced, what sort of level of culture, for the most part, the Visigoths and the Vandals were not what you would consider quote-unquote civilized. When the Moors came in, they found that these people had a practice known as the Ius Malatractandi. The Ius Malatractandi is a medieval Latin reference known as the evil usages. Under the evil usages, if I was a Visigothic king or prince and I chose to take something that you possessed, all I had to do was pay a fee. That included your property, that included your wife, that included anything you owned. So I'd say, well, I like your land and I like your estate. I think I'll have it. So I'd go, if I was a royal ancestor, you had to be part of the royalty, of course, part of the burgesses, and you go to the king, and the king would open the book and say, well, for X amount of money, pesetas, you then can take so-and-so's property, land, wife, etc. You had a situation where the Visigoths, under the Ius Malatractandi, also would engage in all kinds of torture against women, children, etc. And again, based on not so much criminal activity, but based on also greed. If you had something I wanted, I took it and I paid the fee. Something known as a koima or a kamuna, which was the fee that you paid to get something. As a result of this kind of reality, many historians have pointed out that the presence of the Moors coming into Spain, was not so much simply a decision to invade for the purpose of either spreading Islam or simply gaining control of the area. But many people pointed out that there were large groups of Jews who were in the Iberian Peninsula, who were under the control, under the subordination of the Visigothic kings, who were quote-unquote Christian, who then decided that they needed some outside help. And this Jewish group, which we call today the Sephardic or Sephardim, something that sometimes we may confuse, is kind of recognized being Jewish as being part of a singular race, or being part of a European group. But North African Jews are referred to as Sephardic or Sephardim in terms of their ethnicity. This group, which was within the country, had asked the Moors, had sent emissaries into North Africa, and asked the Moors about what their intentions were, because they were catching hell in the Iberian Peninsula, and things looked right for control and subordination in the Iberian Peninsula, and kind of invited and begged the Moors, to a certain extent, to come into the area, to free them, in essence. So you have historians who talk about that element. Then you have another element which refers to the Moors going in because they chose to get control of the region for the purpose of expanding the borders of Islam and getting more land in general in use for agriculture and so forth. Excuse me, before I go on, did you have any?
No, all your questions, please. Just go ahead. All your questions.
So, given this, the Moors enter the area in 710 and are controlled by 711. The Moors also enter into Sicily and Crete, 827, they entered Crete, and they're there till 961. The impact upon the culture of the inhabitants of Spain, what is now Spain, Portugal, Greece, Sicily, etc., would include the following. The Moors set up a postal system. They become the backbone of metal, wood, leather, wool, and the silk industries. They have a sewage system and latrines with hot and cold running water by the 10th century. Lighted streets, they're practicing food preservation through dehydration, preserving wheat for as long as 100 years. In fact, a man named Ibn al-Aswan, writing in the 12th century, wrote a book on how to preserve corn oil, how to preserve various fruits and vegetables through the process of dehydration. What's unique about this is that the Moors simply didn't engage in these activities without writing them down, but they were voluminous writers. They also, as we will see, set up a system of libraries and a book-selling system where these books and materials are made available not only to the population of Andalus, but the people beyond those borders. The Moors introduced new agricultural and irrigation methods, which made the land vastly more productive than it had been under the Romans, and certainly under the Visigoths. They made algebra and exact science and founded plane and spherical trigonometry, which never existed among the Greeks. Pharmacology, surgery, cauterization, ophthalmic surgery, lithotrites, which is the destruction of kidney stones, and the establishing of a licensing exam for physicians were a part of Moorish society, what the Moors instituted into the region. Meanwhile, Europeans are relying on charms and amulets, visits to holy shrines. You had people going to a cathedral in Chartres in order to get well. If someone was said to be sick, they would either, generally the treatments were as follows. Either you would simply pray for the person and take them to a holy shrine, or you would leech them. You know what leeching is? You basically you cover someone in leeches and then hope that it sucks all the impurities and so forth and everything out of the person, and it did, along with life itself. The Moors also were using monkey skeletons imported from Africa when cadavers weren't available. What does that then tell us about what the Moors knew anatomically, physiologically? It tells us that the Moors were obviously aware of some sort of physiological and anatomical connection between primates and humans. Now, I'm careful on this because I will say this. The Moors didn't say that people descended from apes. I leave that to Charles Darwin because I think there's something else, there's something quote-unquote Freudian about that. That's the whole nother topic. But the Moors simply said that there was recognized there was an anatomical and physiological correlation between primates and humans. For that reason, if you were practicing as a surgeon, which the Moors excelled in, you could use certain sorts of primates to figure out where certain things were. And that way, when engaged in any kind of medical practices, you knew what the body structure was. As Europeans, who are also a part of the society, because now you have, again, Visigoths and Vandals, who are quote-unquote Germanic people, who are living in the area, who are taken control of, in terms of the nation itself, by the Moors. But what happens is, these people begin to recognize the impact of these Moors on developing their own civilization, and they begin to consider the Moors as almost, in many cases, supernatural or superhuman in terms of their understanding of certain science and their understanding of the natural world. As a result, they then begin to try to enter and study with the Moors. The Moors do not establish a system where they exclude anyone from the madrasas. The madrasas are the schools. Schools are open to all. They don't care if you're Muslim, Christian, or indifferent. The school's open to everyone, and as a result, the quote-unquote Spaniards, and they become Spaniards later, because obviously at this point there is no Spain, but the people who will become the Spaniards end up studying Moorish philosophy, Moorish sciences, and making use of this, ultimately, for their own social and political aggrandizement later. As a result, people beyond the borders of Andalus, which is what the Moors called the Iberian Peninsula, begin to hear about what's happening in Moorish Spain. So people start to come into the area to study. You have a nun writing in a German province in Saxony about the Moorish cities as being the jewel of the jewels of the world. The major cities, Cordova, Seville, Toledo, Granada, those areas become central centers for study of Moorish philosophy and science, and Europeans are flooding the borders. As long as they come in peace, as they say, there's no problem. You have in the city of Cordova, in the 10th century, 1,600 mosques, 900 public baths, 213,000 middle-class homes, 60,000 mansions, and 80,000 shops, 20,000 of which are booksellers, or bookshops. This is in the 10th century. And this is going to play very prominently later when we see what happens. 20,000 bookshops. Wealthier homes had 2 floors, a library, gardens, and running water. The population, again in the 10th century, is between 500,000 to 1 million people. And that's in the city of Cordova alone. England had barely that amount in its entire borders at that time. Needless to say, England was also steeped in squalor and filth, and actually had considerable contempt for bathing. And this plays very prominently later. I don't know if you've ever seen this book, but I think, by all means, you might call this the equalizer. Because when Europeans find out about their own history, their own love affair with dirt, written by their own, and African nationals didn't write this book. Terence McLaughlin. Terence McLaughlin is an Englishman. I think he's a journalist, and he did a history of dirt. And reveals some very interesting things. Maybe I'll read a few sections just to make my point. McLaughlin is describing the monasteries, and he points out that the monasteries were considered the cleanest places initially because the monks bathed, or I should say changed their clothes once a year. Here was found a deep pit, 18 foot 8 inches long, the walls 15 inches thick. The depth of the pit below the cloister floor was 25 feet. Filled in the pit were old gowns torn up by the monks and used as toilet paper. Evidence too that the monks suffered from digestive troubles as a result of not having bathed but once a year. There was another section that I wanted to get, and I'll see if I can find it, because that's mild by comparison. Page 7. See, these are the books that I never came across in history class. No, studying history, European history, and nobody talked about this. This is the beloved King James. And this is an account written by one of his contemporaries. This is one of his English brethren. In describing him, he says, his beard was very thin, his tongue too large for his mouth, which made him drink very uncomely, as if drinking his tongue. which came out to the cup of each side of his mouth. His skin was soft as taffeta sarcenet, which felt so because he never washed his hands, only rubbed his finger ends slightly with the wet end of a napkin. His legs are very weak, having had, as some thought, some foul play in his youth, or rather before he was born, that he was not able to stand at 7 years of age. That weakness made him ever leaning on other men's shoulders. His walk was ever circular, his fingers ever in that walk, fiddling about his codpiece. Now, that's an interesting point itself. He tells us earlier that King James would also wear his clothes until they were falling off of his body. He wore his clothes unto rags.
Which King James?
King James the First.
Okay, as long as not the one that got the Bible.
As long as it's not the one who wrote the Bible. Why? We did the same thing. Yeah, that's another lecture. We're told also that in the centers, in European centers, particularly in areas like Sicily, where there was a large Moorish presence in the 13th and 12th century, we're told that the Moors, who had reintroduced the concept of bathing to some of the Italians, but to some of the other European peoples, there was no reintroduction of bathing. There was no bathing. The Angles, the Saxons, the Picts didn't bathe. The Italians, the Romans bathed. They had bathhouses. When Rome fell, that was it. Romans stopped bathing as well. So in the case of the Moors, they reintroduced this, but for some reason, the Anglo-Saxons and the Picts and the people who were now recognized as the Brits considered bathing as something that was self-indulgent. And people were actually killed. You could be killed if you were caught bathing. Now that plays a very prominent role again because we consider the relationship between hygiene, prevention of disease, etc. We see the relationship here. In fact, Frederick II, who was one of the patrons of some Moorish scholars who were under his, within his court, who he had hired, he was so intrigued and so immersed in Moorish philosophy and science and ideas, including bathing, that the Pope, the Vatican, considered him to be a Muslim, or considered him to have renounced the Holy Catholic faith because he was operating outside of Catholic dogma at that time. Now, scholars, Moorish scholars, who begin to make their way by way of their texts into European centers, European schools, cathedral schools as they were called, were individuals such as Abu al-Walid ibn Rushdi, also known as Averroes, Ibn Sina, also known as Avicenna, Ibn Zar, also Ibn Zur. These individuals are writing books on everything from medical science to philosophy. And the books, after having been written within the Moorish centers, within Moorish schools, are even translated into the developing European languages and then sent into other countries, and sent into France, sent into Spain, into other parts of England, and into what was the Germanic states at that time. So all this information is making its way outside of Al-Andalus and into European centers. Averroes, who lives in the 12th century, is born in Cordova. He's a philosopher, physician, mathematician. He wrote a book which describes and illustrated in great detail the function of the retina of the eye, among other medical findings and practices. His text, which in 1215 is translated into Latin and used extensively at such schools as Chartres, which becomes the University of Paris, Bologna in Italy, and Naples, University of Naples, which we'll talk about in a moment, Oxford, and other universities. This becomes the cornerstone of the medical studies, his writings, his books. It also ends up finding its way into the church dogma by way of Thomas Aquinas, as we'll see shortly. Another scholar by the name of Avicenna which is what the Europeans call him, they anglicized his name. His name was Abu Bakr ibn Baha, born in Saragossa in the 11th century, prompted the interest of a scientifically emaciated European group or culture. Abapace was also a geologist, and he performed various studies on the Earth's crust, stratified rocks, and classified minerals. His texts, too, are extensively translated. Abu Marwan ibn Zur, known as Ibn Zur, was Averroes' medical teacher, a civilian-born Moor who wrote on tumors, abscesses, and therapeutics. He was a physician to the Almohad and Almoravid courts, and his text, Kitab al-Taysir, talked about pharmacy and nutrition, and this is translated into Latin in 1280 and also used at the major medieval schools of Europe. Now again, what's significant about the Almoravid and Almohad courts that he works for is that you have a situation where the first wave of Africans, as well as some Arabs, come into the Iberian Peninsula in the 8th century, in 710, 711. For the next 2 centuries, waves of more and more Africans, primarily Africans, are coming into the area and Africanizing the general public, including the Europeans in terms of, including lineage, and also in terms of ideas. As a result, the Almohads and the Almoravids, who come from the area of Mali, Ghana, and Songhai, are a dynasty that's established in the 11th and then 12th centuries, which adds another wave of Africans. So if the first wave wasn't enough, you have 2 more waves, which again bring more African blood and bring more African ideas, African cosmology, which we find then manifesting itself in an African way in Andalus. And this is something that I should stress. Moorish Spain, even though this is an Islamic nation or Islamic kingdom, does not have the same sort of practice, the same sort of cosmologies that predominate in other parts of the Islamic world. The Moors introduce a concept of Islam which actually starts to look more like ancient Kemetic concepts or cosmologies, which in fact I can't talk about in great detail at this time, but I'll mention this now. Dr. Van Soderma and myself just finished writing a book on the Moors, which will be coming out in September. So I would direct you, if you get a chance, in the library or whatever, to please pick it up, and then you can read through that section. But the Moors have a particular brand of Islam, which manifests itself in other parts of Spain and other parts of Europe. And the reaction to this manifestation is very interesting. The Moors recognize that knowledge of the natural world, knowledge of self is primary. They don't believe in placing a great deal of emphasis on faith alone. In essence, as I put it, the Moors' basic philosophy was one should reason oneself into the corner of faith, not simply accept something on faith alone. What you find happening, obviously, is a great deal of tension between the Catholic Church, which is still within the borders of Andalus. The Moors take control of the region in terms of politics and to a certain extent socially, militarily as well. But there's no cancellation of the Catholic presence. The Moors do not tell the Catholics you must convert to Islam. They do not tell the people that you must do it this way. In fact, the Moors recognize the authority of the Catholic Church over its Catholic masses. This is very unique, particularly in this time period, because in those days, the church was the state. You couldn't be a practicing Muslim in a Catholic kingdom. You had to be Catholic. If you were burned for heresy or burned for blasphemy against the faith. So the Moors recognize a religious tolerance which does not exist in the Catholic world and does not exist on the same level even in other parts of the Islamic world when you get into the 9th and 10th centuries. The Moors recognized then that one should study the natural sciences, one should study philosophy for the purpose of knowing God. Their idea was, if I study God, if I seek to know what a God force is, then I need to study the natural world because everything around me is a manifestation of the Creator. Everything around me is another element of that creative force. If I remove my idea of God from the various elements in society and say it's outside of me, it's over here. It's Jesus of Norway as opposed to Jesus, which is what I refer to most of the images we see. Jesus of Norway as opposed to Jesus of Nazareth. It's not this image of man that stands, because if we do that, where's the feminine principle? Where's the feminine principle then in the God force? If I talk about God as having a gender. So that was one of the reasons why they said they backed off of, say, a Christian, European Christian concept. But at the same time, that's also why they backed off the patriarchal concepts that begin to predominate even in Islam in consecutive centuries. And this is a part, in fact, of the tension that begins to exist between the Moors in the Iberian Peninsula and other Islamic peoples, the Arabs and the Syrians, outside of the area. Because while Syrian Islam and later Arab Islam seeks to implement a more patriarchal concept of Islam, the Moors are still recognizing the two concepts, the feminine and masculine principles that make up what is referred to as Allah. Interestingly enough, this sort of cosmology makes its way into European culture in the form of a group known as the Cathars or the Albigensians. The Cathars are a society that establishes itself in southern France, right along the border of Andalus. It arises around the early 11th century. Shortly after, again, the Moors and their ideas, their texts start filtering beyond the borders of Moorish control, as well as obviously within the borders of Moorish control, where European Christians resided, European Catholics resided, etc. And as this information begins to move further north into areas of France, this community called the Cathars, or the Albigensians, develops. This community asserts that Jesus is a prophet, yet these are European Christians, quote unquote. That one must recognize the feminine principle in the God force. And for that reason, you have women who are priests, known as the parfaits. You have a concept of dual unity which exists, which means that these two forces are working together almost in a ma'atic fashion to maintain a balance. And I guess in the case of ma'at meaning maintenance of harmony in the ancient Kemetic belief system. Ma'at is meant to maintain that balance between the two forces, and there is quote-unquote good and quote-unquote evil. The idea is to maintain a balance and to make sure good dominates. Concepts at the time for obvious. And they say on earth because they're in school, and that you're here in order to gain a certain understanding of self. And then once you complete this level, you then go on to the next. This arises in beyond the borders of Moorish control, as well as obviously within the borders of Moorish control, where European Christians resided, European Catholics resided, etc. And as this, or the Albigensians develops, this community asserts that Jesus is a prophet, yet these are European Christians, quote unquote. That one must recognize the feminine principle in the God force. And for that reason, you have women who are priests, known as the parfaits. You have a concept of dual unity which exists, which means that these two forces are working together almost in a ma'atic fashion to maintain a balance. and I guess in the case of Ma'at meaning maintenance of harmony in the ancient Kemetic belief system. Ma'at is meant to maintain that balance between the two forces, and there is quote-unquote good and quote-unquote evil. The idea is to maintain a balance and to make sure good dominates. Now that flies in the face, too, of European Catholic concepts at the time for obvious reasons. They also believe in reincarnation. And they say that one is on earth because they're in school, and that you're here in order to gain a certain understanding of self. And then once you complete this level, you then go on to the next. This arises in the French Christian community around an area which is now known as the Languedoc, towns such as Rennes-le-Château, which is again in the area of southern France. Now, what's interesting about this, and again, just to, I won't say digress because it's relevant, but to say a little bit of something about, again, clashes of cosmology, because this is important in recognizing what European ideas represent versus African or Asian ideas, and how it manifests itself in history, this clash of concepts about the universe. The Catholic Church becomes angered by the rise of the Cathar society because they are a flowering civilization. The only other place that was flowering as much in terms of science and in terms of schools of philosophy and in terms of agricultural achievement, etc., were areas in Andalus, in Moorish Spain, of course, areas in Africa and areas in Asia. That's the only other place. In the Catholic European community, you didn't have this. You had, again, squalor exemplified by what I mentioned from Terence McLaughlin's text, dirt. And educated meant simply you could recite references from the Bible. 99% of the European Christian community, Catholic community, was illiterate, versus 60%, 70%, at least based on the records from the 16th and based on the records from the 11th and 12th centuries in Moorish Spain, based on the Moorish, the Andalusian population being primarily literate, having emphasized the need to study the world and study natural science in order to gain understanding of a creative force. But the Catholic Church begins to take an interest in the society because they see them as a threat. They say, what are these people doing and talking about women as an element in the Catholic, in any holy faith? What are you talking about Jesus as a prophet? And what's this stuff about being on earth to learn a lesson and then you, if necessary, come back to? We don't want to hear that. Not to mention the fact that elements in the Catholic Church saw the area as ripe for conquest because of the riches and wealth that existed in the area. So they launched a crusade known as the Albigensian Crusades. 1209, Pope Innocent III, the first, probably in European history, the first recorded genocide of Europeans in European history. 15,000 men, women, and children murdered in the course of 2 days. And that's in one city. That's in one city. The crusade goes on for 40 years. And the creed of the Pope, Pope Innocent III, is when asked about how do we know who's guilty and who's not guilty, the Pope says, kill them all, God will sort out the rest. Which is precisely what they do. Now, what's ironic here, and before I forget, you might want to try to read this because this is a fascinating text. Holy Blood, Holy Grail. Holy Blood, Holy Grail, written by 3 authors, a guy named Henry Lincoln, Michael Bagent, Henry Lincoln, Michael Bagent, Baigent, and Richard Leigh, Leigh. They talk about this very issue of how the Catholic Church annihilated a group of people whose spiritual ideas were not rooted in European cosmology. They were coming from Eastern and African traditions, and ultimately how this information, the Moorish information of the Eastern knowledge, goes under the society, mainstream society. It becomes a part of secret societies, such as the Freemasons, the Rosicrucians, the Shriners, the Daughters of the Nile, the Order of Zion, and other groups. And how this information goes underground because it's considered a threat, first to the Catholic Church, but then as these organizations get power, they then decide to monopolize the knowledge as well. In the Moorish reality, in African reality, at that time at least, Africans were saying, the Moors were saying, knowledge is for everybody. You're all here to get some understanding of self and the outside world in order to get through this particular life. So you make things accessible. But what you have is a group of people then saying, well, no, knowledge, if I control the knowledge, I can control the masses. If I can shape your reality for you, I can guide you along like the best of the behaviorists. B.F. Skinner would be proud. So what they did, is they began to implement secret societies which govern what's happening behind the scenes and give the panacea of a watered down concept of religion, what Christ was really talking about, what Muhammad was really talking about, peace be upon them both, because they didn't want the people to be able to get out from under the iron hand of control. This also is part of the reason why when people talk about the Moors, it's usually very spurious. It may be a footnote, or people automatically jump into an Arab mode to talk about the Arabs, even though people remember the place consistently as Moorish Spain. Just keep using the term synonymously with Arab, because then people began to have a different perspective of what Islamic concepts meant at that time and their connection to other belief systems, such as those that existed in the Nile Valley, etc. George James talks about in Stolen Legacy how the Moors were the custodians of ancient Kemetic knowledge. So, these are things that once in a while they pop to the surface, but there's so little to keep it there that sometimes we lose sight of it. And again, in terms of praxis, we start to see, as things come together, just how significant all this is contemporaneously. Okay, so Europeans have an environment right there on European soil, which is engaged in studies in pharmacy, medical science, anatomy, astrology, mathematics. Man named Gerbert of Aurillac later becomes Pope Sylvester II, introduces so-called Arabic numerals into Europe in the 10th century after having studied among the Moors. This information is disseminated, and the history shifts. It's a little bit difficult to explain, and as I say, in 5 words or 5 sentences or less. But the Catholic Church vacillates as to its reaction to the Moorish information. Sometimes they allow it to come in and allow the people to study it. Other times they go after them, and it depends on who's in power. But ultimately, the reason for this vacillation is they knew the only way that they could ultimately get control was to allow some of the information to come over their way. Then once we get it, I use it against you. I got your information, not even a thank you, but I take the information and then proceed to use it against you. That includes scientific knowledge. It also includes spiritual knowledge. So this information then becomes a part of the Catholic Church at different times, manifests itself through different individuals such as Thomas Aquinas, I mentioned earlier. I'll go into him a little bit later. So let me just recognize 4 elements, 4 modes of European acquisition of information. 1, direct study. Europeans can go right into Andalus and study at any one of the madrasas. They can study in Seville, they can study in Granada, they can study in Cordova, they can study in Toledo, they can study at any of the major centers, and they do. People like Peter Abelard, I'm familiar with European intellectual history. These are people who are the cornerstones of European intellectual history, who you'll hear talked about in an intellectual heritage class, but no one explains where they got the information. Same situation, I say, with the Greeks. All of a sudden, we just discussed, and the Greeks developed such and such. You know, Aristotle wrote 1,000 books. Aristotle, and on all kinds of topics. Just the man was a walking brain, just in every subject. Nobody knows. So it came to him in a dream, I guess. Even to the point that references in European classical, references in Greek, ancient Greek history. Even though they speak of an African connection, nobody draws any parallels when they're talking in intellectual heritage class. Why does Zeus come from Ethiopia in the Greek myth? Myth is very revealing, yet people don't go any further. That's pretty strange. Like if all of a sudden in the myth of George Washington, people say George Washington came from Japan. You better look and find out what is the connection between George and Japan. What's Zeus doing, the king of the gods, coming from Ethiopia, coming from Africa? What is Epaphus? Epaphus, who was the son of Zeus and Io. Epaphus is the one who is said to be the progenitor of the Greek peoples. His father was Zeus. So what are the Greeks telling us about their own beginnings? Then you have people like Strabo and Olympiodorus, who in their own writings are talking about getting information from the Africans, from Kemet. So these are things that, again, Europeans they begin, not at the beginning, they begin with themselves. And don't get into a discussion of where anything came from. And that continues up to the present, to the Statue of Liberty, right? Just made it, for immigrants, we assume. So people like Peter Abelard, Roger Bacon, Thomas Aquinas, Mike Scott, Giordano Bruno. Later, in fact, Giordano Bruno was burned in the 17th century for saying, to the 16th century, for saying he got his information from the Moors. He said it at the wrong time. See, depending on the time you lived, you might get away with it. He said it at a time when he said, no, that stuff is now under the table. You don't come with us with this. And then as a result, he's killed. But these are the heavy hitters of European intellectual tradition. And they are studying in Moorish Spain. The purchase of books. I already mentioned in Cordova alone, there are 20,000 booksellers. The Moors took a census. The Moors they took censuses. And so they wanted to know who was how many people were in a particular city, because they had taxes. They set up municipalities. These were things that were a part of the system. We kind of think that this contemporary concept of an urban center is something that comes out of Europe. Africans have been doing it for centuries. We always tend to think of, if we're not informed, I know you all are informed, if you picture Africa 1,000 years ago, unless it's in Egypt, people think of huts and little villages, no urban centers. But there were always urban centers where people were coming to trade goods and so forth that they were getting from the outlying areas, from the country regions. So the idea of the Europeans acquiring this information through books by going into urban centers is another element. Moors who leave the country and go into other areas. Oxford University has a man on its rolls, because let me tell you what I had to do in order to do the preliminary research. When I was doing my master's to do the research on the impact of the Moors, my question was as follows. I'd heard a lot about the significance of Africans in developing the European academic system, but I didn't know where was the evidence. I want to see it distinctly. I want to see it in the Latin. I want to see it in the medieval. I want to see the documents. So I started having documents sent from the University of Madrid, a place called the Instituto de Arias in Spain. I had things sent from California. And reading through this information, I had curriculum roles. In other words, what was taught at particular universities at particular points in time. I checked the listings of who were the teachers at particular colleges and universities. Why was a particular university established? What was its charter? What was its creed? when I started finding out that the major schools of Europe, the ones that are now considered the cornerstones of European intelligentsia and academia, Oxford, University of Paris, University of Naples, Bologna, University of Palencia in Spain, Salamanca, all these places had as their chartered purpose the study of the Moorish texts. They had set up these schools to make use of the information that was coming in. They were not all what's called cathedral schools. Cathedral school you went to only to study Christianity, Catholicism. These schools were developing to study the sciences and the philosophy that the Moors had been introducing in Andalus. And when you look and you see names like Adam de Marisco on the faculty roll for Oxford University in the 12th century, it might pass you by unless you know what de Marisco means. De Marisco means of the Moors. Adam of the Moors. Hence, many names, in fact, that people had in those days, you either said where you came from in terms of regionally or who you came from in terms of blood. Hence the name Moor that so many Europeans carry today and don't know what they're carrying. If they knew, if they look at one of in their books of heraldry, they'd probably pass out to see what's there. In fact, and I'll show some of those examples a little bit later. So these are things that were necessary, getting these texts and getting these curriculum roles to see for myself. And I have to say, my advisors were all Europeans, University of Pennsylvania, Columbia University, doctorate in history, all Europeans were shocked. They were like, well, how did you get this information? Why would you even think to look for such information? But they couldn't, as I said, they couldn't touch it. They still had to say, give me the grade because the work was thorough. But to this day, I'll never forget the face of one of my professors when I came in with some of these documents in the medieval Spanish sent from Spain. He just sat there, just kind of shaking. Like he had Parkinson's. I see you've really done your work. So, I mean, this is something obviously that's required. We need to, as I tell, it's our responsibility as doctoral students is we have to teach undergraduates. And I say we need an army of scholars. Definitely do the research, do the work, learn another language. And if you can, travel and engage. If you meet people from different places, everything will give you leads. I go through life as a detective. I listen to language, I look at linguistics and etymology, I listen to myth, putting it all together to try to understand what has come to pass, because these people have pulled so much wool over our eyes that it takes more than one hand, a disciplinary hand to pull it up. We need to take different disciplines as well to pull that wool off. So, I mean, this is something that, in fact, you'll find some historians will actually negate. I had one professor tell me when I was talking about the African presence in the Americas, in Mexico, and I was talking about the evidence in linguistics and the evidence in religious practices and the evidence in myth and the evidence from documented accounts given by Spanish explorers. He told me, you're just grabbing up everything from everywhere. The myth is not acceptable. That's not acceptable. Linguistics, you're out of your discipline. I said, if I came into a courtroom bringing one witness to establish a case, and said, look, so-and-so didn't commit the crime, and here's my one witness to tell you why. And my opponent comes in, he's got 8 witnesses, wiretaps, artifacts, and everything else, and lays it out. Who's going to build a better case? Ironically, that's why the foundation of law is history, because it's teaching you how to pull it all together. But yet when it comes down to it, in the world of historiography or historicity, when you present this information to a European historian, they say, no, see, because you didn't give it as we put it. See, just read these authors. That's it. And don't start reasoning. I don't want to hear any analysis now. And when I did this in the presence of a historian from Mexico, This man who was a Mexican is telling me you're right. Telling me, absolutely. And this European American, Jewish fella, European Jewish fella, Ashkenazim, is sitting there saying, no, I've never heard that. Everybody can claim being in America. And this Mexican historian standing there telling him, yes, there is an African presence. You can go to Veracruz and see it. There's a tradition that you can find about Yanga in the tradition of Mexico. You see the Olmec heads. I mean, what more do you, this man is from Mexico. He grew up there, and this European American's telling him, you don't know what you're no, you're wrong. I mean, the arrogance is something else that's intriguing. The level of arrogance they would feel comfortable with doing this. So, having said all that, you recognize what I had to go through in order to get this done, and that's why I say I know that what I say is true, and I know that what I say is historically founded. I have problems with people who present shabby scholarship because it ultimately hurts African scholarship as we try to build our case. If you have people who are not thorough, then we run into trouble. So I actually like the idea of having these Europeans standing in front of that door for me, because I knew that I'd have to fight hard to get through it. So hopefully, like I say, it'll pay off now as it gets out beyond the book and into the mind of the general public.
And that, brothers and sisters, is what I hope I have achieved tonight. I hope that this unique broadcast tonight has given you something to research for yourself, giving you something to think about, ideals. I want to thank you all, the chatters, the viewers, the supporters. Thank you. All my Patreon followers, people who use Super Chat, just thank you for supporting the show. If you look at the past 400 videos, it's because of your help. Thank you for easing the burden, so I actually have time to do the research, actually have time to put together a show, a program for you guys that's actually thought-provoking. That's not the BS. That's not the joke, because playtime is over, y'all. Playtime is over. And I hope that you guys, have a chance. You please check out Black Sunrise channel. Please check out the sister's channel. I mean, she is doing so much good work, bringing forth so much information. Brothers and sisters, we have to help each other, especially those of us, kind of down here just in obscurity. Persona su juris. I'm almost getting it. I'm almost there. The main point is, brother, can I get a witness? And I pray the answer, once I get prepared, will be yes. And on that will conclude TPIM SR Live for tonight. I'm your host, True Power is Mine. Today's date, January 27, 2020, the year of our Lord. Don't believe me? Look at the mo right there. Year of our Lord, 1795. Excellent year for liberation. Thank you, Brother Wes, Brother David, Brother A1, Brother Al, Cool Kim, Smoke Less, Brother Timothy, welcome to the show. MW, welcome to the show. Thank you. The Black Zionists in the house. Brother Jeff Sherman, Brother Isaac, Kim, and Brother Jason Moon. Thank you. You guys could have been doing anything. You brothers and sisters could have been doing anything tonight. But you elected to sit here and feed on the knowledge with me and others. We are truly stronger together, y'all. Thank you, thank you, thank you. So without further ado, live your life with integrity without hate, envy, or greed. As always, brothers and sisters, I ask you, please, 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 let's try to be kinder to each other. Peace in our power, unity in our victory, and dignity in our respect. Liberation. I'm out.